And particularly if you don't understand the American history of policing in communities of color. Because if you don't understand that history, then to proclaim and to demand that Black Lives Matter seems like something special. So folks trip out and they freak out. Oh, well, Black lives, well, all lives matter. Yes, sweetheart, they do. That is true and utterly irrelevant to the current moment. Of course, all lives matter. Nobody said otherwise. But you don't have to proclaim that which is taken for granted. You have to proclaim that which is ignored. You see, when white people say all, we never meant it. Black people know that. Brown people know that. Most white people never had to really learn that. So we said all men are created equal, and we didn't mean that shit. You see, we said it, but we didn't mean it. We said it, and we wrote black people and brown folks out of all. So when black people of color hear, when black and brown folks hear all lives matter, what they hear is the same thing they heard with all men are created equal, that it was a setup, that it was a lie that didn't include them. So if you want to actually make it clear that all lives matter, A, you got to act like all lives matter, and you got to really treat people like all lives matter, and B, you have to proclaim that the lives that you denigrated for centuries actually matter, because that is the part that gets left out. You see? So when we say all lives matter, just to put this in perspective, how ridiculous this comeback is, how absurd, how sophomoric, how nonsensical it is for us to respond to Black Lives Matter with all lives matter. Let's take it back to like 1971 when the title, when the phrase, when the statement on the street was what? Black is beautiful. That was the way that black folks were trying to take back notions of beauty from a fashion industry, from a glamour industry that had basically defined beauty as white, right? And so black folks were saying black is beautiful, reclaiming their own beauty standards and norms. To say all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter would be like getting in a time machine tonight, going back to 1971, hearing somebody say black is beautiful and interrupting them so as to let them know, well, we're all beautiful in our own way. Yeah, shut up, we know. Sort of misses the point. Be like going back to the early 80s, right, when the HIV/AIDS crisis hit. And in those first few years of the HIV/AIDS crisis, remember, we had a government that did nothing. President Reagan sat by and watched thousands of people die before he even uttered the term AIDS. He only said something because his buddy Rock Hudson from the movies died of it. And then he decided he would speak on it and begin to cut loose some research funds for it. But for the first couple of years, didn't want to say anything about it, right? And there were activist groups out in the street, right? ACT UP, Gay Men's Health Crisis, others out in the street demanding funding for AIDS research. And what they were in effect saying, even though they didn't use the term and even though we didn't have hashtags in those days, right? Ultimately what they were saying was people with AIDS lives matter. So to say all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter would be like going back to one of those rallies in 1982, 1983, interrupting the rally for AIDS funding to remind everyone that, well, people die of pancreatic cancer too. Yes, sweetheart, and totally irrelevant to the current situation. You have to demand recognition of the thing that gets swept under the rug. That's black life, that's brown life, that's people of color, you see, because we are a country built on the premise that black lives didn't matter. And I know we don't want to hear that, but that's just truth. We're built on a society that said that black lives didn't matter except insofar as they could provide cheap labor to enrich white people. That was how black folks were viewed, as cheap labor, expendable labor. I should also point out, it is how indigenous people were viewed, as people who could be expendable and committed genocide against without hesitation. It was also the way that many Asian Americans were viewed when they were brought here from places like China to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, worked to death, didn't care if they died or not. It's the way that Latino folks were viewed when in the 1930s we expelled tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands actually, of Mexican Americans who were citizens of this country, and we sent them back to Mexico in spite of their citizenship to free up jobs for white men. You didn't learn that in high school history. Maybe you ought to ask your history teacher why.